Lightning split the darkening Ohio sky, illuminating a scene torn from a nightmare. 16-year-old Sophie Miller struggled against the rough ropes, binding her wrists to the ancient oak tree, her blonde hair plastered to her face by the first heavy drops of rain. The massive tree stood alone in the field, half a mile from the nearest road, a silent witness to her terror. "Let's see how long it takes for someone to care about you, farm girl." Sean Hayward had smeared his varsity jacket bright red against the gathering storm clouds. His final words echoed in her mind as the headlights of his pickup truck had disappeared around the bend, carrying him and his laughing friends back to town. Sophie twisted her wrists against the coarse rope, wincing as it bit deeper into her skin. The thunder rumbled closer now, a harbinger of the storm front that local radio had been warning about all day. The kind that tore roofs from barns and flooded the creek beds. The kind no one should be caught outside in. She craned her neck, feeling the rough bark scrape against her back through the thin cotton of her work shirt. The ancient oak had stood in this field for over a century, its sprawling branches now swaying ominously above her as the wind picked up. Once her favorite reading spot, now it had become her prison, and possibly worse if the storm hit before anyone found her. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself, trying to remember what he had taught her. "Assess the situation. Use what you have." What she had was a pocket, and in that pocket was a cell phone, a cheap flip phone she'd saved up for by doing extra chores one her parents didn't even know about. One that contained a number she'd memorized but never dialed. Sophie twisted her body, ignoring the pain as the rope cut deeper. Her fingers trembling from both fear and the rapidly dropping temperature, fumbled for the phone. It slipped once, twice, but she caught it, her breath hitching as she flipped it open with one hand. The screen glowed faintly, a lifeline in the gathering dark. She dialed the number, her heart racing as it rang once, twice, three times. Then a voice answered, low and steady, cutting through the static like a blade through silk. "Miller, Sophie, speak." It was him, the one person who had promised to always be there. "Uncle Mike," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They tied me to the oak tree. The storm's coming. I can't get free." There was a brief silence. Then his tone shifted to a steel edge, replacing the warmth. "Location, landmarks, distance from home. The old oak in the east field, half a mile from the house near Becker's Creek. Stay calm. I'm coming." His voice was rock steady, but she could hear barked orders in the background. The sound of movement. "Don't hang up. Keep the line open." The rain began to fall harder as Sophie clutched the phone, her lifeline to a man who had once promised to protect her, a man who was now thousands of miles away. The Miller family farm, known locally as Oakwood, sat on 80 acres of prime Ohio farmland that had been in the family for 4 generations. From the air, it resembled a patchwork quilt, squares of cornfields beside strips of soybeans, the weathered red barn and white farmhouse nestled between them like a centerpiece. Inside that farmhouse, Sophie Miller had grown up learning the rhythms of farm life. Each morning began before dawn, her father's gentle knock on her door at 500 a.m., as reliable as the rooster's crow. By 5:30, she would be in the barn helping with the morning milking of their small dairy herd, 12 Holstein cows that provided just enough income to supplement the crops. The Millers weren't wealthy by any modern standard, but Sophie had never wanted for the essentials. Her bedroom was small but cozy, with faded floral wallpaper her mother had hung before she was born, and bookshelves her father had built from oak harvested on their own land. The window overlooked the eastern field, and on clear mornings, the sunrise painted the old oak tree in gold. A miller always takes care of the land, and the land takes care of a miller. Her father would say, his calloused hands gently showing her how to test soil or repair fencing. Richard Miller was a man of few words but deep conviction, his face weathered by decades of sun and wind, his back slightly stooped from years of physical labor. The Vietnam War veteran carried himself with quiet dignity, his military service evident in his disciplined approach to farm management and family life. Helen Miller, Sophie's mother, balanced the farm's books with the same precision she used when canning summer vegetables for winter months. A former nurse, she had instilled in Sophie a love of learning that transcended their rural isolation. Their living room bookshelf held classics alongside agricultural manuals, and dinner conversations often ranged from crop rotation strategies to Shakespeare's sonnets. Sophie had inherited her father's quiet determination and her mother's sharp mind. By 16, she could drive the family's 1986 Ford tractor as skillfully as her father, repair a fence post without supervision, and had read more books than anyone else in her class at Millfield High. But Oakwood, like many family farms in the region, was struggling. The massive International Harvester combine that had been the pride of the farm in the 1980s now frequently broke down, parts becoming increasingly difficult to find. The tractor needed a new transmission they couldn't afford. Last winter's heating bills had forced them to dip into the emergency fund, and this summer's drought had reduced their corn yield by nearly 30%. What the Millers didn't discuss, at least not when Sophie was in earshot, were the certified letters from Agritech that had been arriving with increasing frequency. The massive agricultural conglomerate had been buying up family farms throughout the county, converting them to industrial-scale operations with minimal human oversight. Their headquarters, a gleaming glass structure on the outskirts of Millfield, seemed to mock the weathered barns and farmhouses that had stood for generations. The day before Sophie found herself tied to the oak tree, she had overheard her parents talking in hushed tones at the kitchen table, her father's voice tight with worry. "They've offered 20% less than market value, Helen. It's highway robbery. But if we can't make the property tax payment next quarter, I'll find a way. A Miller has worked this land since my grandfather's time. I won't be the one to lose it." Sophie had slipped away before they noticed her, the weight of adult concerns settling uncomfortably on her young shoulders. She understood more than they realized. The new development on the north side of town, with its identical houses and manicured lawns, was built on what had once been the Johnson farm. The massive grain silos that had replaced the Peterson place now bore the Agritech logo. One by one, the families she had grown up with were disappearing, moving to cities, or taking jobs at the very company that had displaced them. That night, sitting at her bedroom window and looking out at the oak tree silhouetted against the stars, Sophie had made a silent promise to herself. She would find a way to save Oakwood. She just didn't know how yet. The summer of 1991 had changed Sophie Miller's life, though she'd been too young to fully understand it at the time. At 8 years old, her world had been limited to Oakwood Farm Millfield Elementary School and the occasional trip into Columbus for special occasions. That June, her father had received a phone call that brought a stranger to their dinner table, a young Army captain recovering from wounds sustained in Operation Desert Storm. Michael Sullivan was the son of Richard Miller's old Army buddy, in need of a quiet place to heal both body and mind before returning to duty. Sophie's first impression of Captain Sullivan had been one of cautious fascination. At 27, he had seemed impossibly grown up to her, 8-year-old eyes, his military bearing, softened by pain he tried to hide. A shrapnel wound from an Iraqi T-72 tank had left him with a limp that the doctors assured him would improve with time and physical therapy. The invisible wounds, the ones that made him startle at sudden noises and wake shouting in the night, would take longer to heal. "Why does he jump when the screen door slams?" Sophie had asked her mother after Sullivan's first week at the farm. Helen Miller had considered her daughter thoughtfully before answering. "Captain Sullivan has been in places where loud noises meant danger. His body remembers even when his mind knows he's safe now." Sophie had nodded, absorbing this information with a child's simplicity. The next day, she had carefully oiled the hinges of the screen door so it wouldn't slam. Sullivan had noticed, though he didn't comment on it directly. Instead, he'd started spending more time with Sophie first, just sitting quietly on the porch while she read her books, then gradually engaging her in conversation. "What are you reading?" he'd asked one afternoon, easing himself onto the porch swing beside her. "Little House on the Prairie," Sophie had replied, showing him the cover. "It's about a girl who lives on a farm a long time ago." Sullivan had smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes, a rarity in those early weeks. "I read those books when I was young. My grandmother had the whole series." That shared interest had opened a door between them. Soon Sullivan was joining Sophie for her morning chores, teaching her how to more efficiently collect eggs and feed the chickens. In return, she showed him her secret reading spot beneath the old oak tree where the sprawling branches created a natural canopy. "This is a good tactical position," he'd observed, scanning the surrounding fields with an automatic vigilance that never quite left him. "You can see anyone approaching from all directions." "What's tactical mean?" Sophie had asked, sounding out the unfamiliar word. Sullivan had settled against the trunk, stretching out his injured leg. "It means it's a smart place to be if you need to watch for visitors." He'd modified his explanation for her young ears, but the soldier in him approved of her instinctive choice of location. As weeks passed, Sullivan's physical strength returned. He began helping Richard with farm tasks, his military precision bringing a new efficiency to their operations. He repaired machinery with tools he fashioned himself, installed an irrigation system that saved hours of manual watering, and reinforced the barn roof before harvest season. For Sophie, however, the most significant changes were the lessons Sullivan shared. Unlike school learning with its focus on facts and figures, Sullivan taught principles, ways of thinking and being that seemed to come from a deeper well of wisdom than his 27 years should have contained. Always be aware of your surroundings, he told her during a walk along the property line. Notice what's different from yesterday. That's how you stay safe. Our fear is information, not a command, he explained when a summer thunderstorm sent her running for the house. Acknowledge it, use it, but don't let it control you. By August, Sullivan moved with barely a trace of his former limp. The nightmares came less frequently. He laughed more easily. Richard and Helen watched the transformation with quiet satisfaction, while Sophie treasured each moment with her unlikely friend. Then came the letter with Army insignia on the envelope. Sullivan read it privately, but that evening at dinner, he shared the news. I've been selected for special training, he said, his expression a mix of pride and something unreadable. I report to Fort Bragg in 2 weeks. Oh, that's wonderful, Mike, Helen had said, though Sophie could hear the concern beneath her mother's congratulations. What kind of specials training? Richard asked, his own military background, giving him insight into what such a selection might mean. Sullivan had glanced at Sophie before answering carefully. The kind that means I won't be able to write or call for a while. Security protocols. Sophie didn't understand the details then, but she grasped the essential truth. Sullivan was leaving, and where he was going would be dangerous. The night before his departure, Sullivan found Sophie at the old oak tree, her small figure huddled against the trunk, a book open but unread in her lap. Mind if I join you? He asked, settling beside her without waiting for an answer. They sat in companionable silence as the sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Finally, Sophie voiced the fear she'd been holding inside. Will you come back? Sullivan considered her question with the seriousness it deserved. I'll try my best, but where I'm going, I can't make promises about that. Sophie nodded, tears welling in her eyes, despite her effort to be brave. But I can promise you this, Sullivan continued, reaching into his pocket. No matter where I am, if you ever truly need me, I'll find a way to help you. He withdrew a set of dog tags on a chain, not his current military ID, but an older set that held significant meaning to him. These were my father's from Vietnam, he explained, placing them in her small hand. I want you to keep them. But they're important to you, Sophie protested. Exactly. Sullivan closed her fingers around the metal tags. And now you're important to me too. There's a number engraved on the back. Not a regular phone number, but a special one. If you're ever in real trouble, the kind no one else can help, with you call that number. It will find me wherever I am. Promise, Sophie had asked, slipping the chain over her head, the tags far too large for her child's frame. I promise, Sullivan said solemnly, but it's only for real emergencies. Life or death. Understand? Sophie nodded, recognizing the gravity of what he was entrusting to her. The next morning, Michael Sullivan drove away from Oakwood Farm in a government-issued vehicle, his few possessions packed efficiently in a single duffel bag. Sophie stood at the end of the driveway, the dog tags hidden beneath her shirt, watching until his car disappeared around the bend. The letters came sporadically after that from Fort Bragg initially, then with APO, addresses that her father explained meant Sullivan was overseas. The contents were general, deliberately vague about his activities, but warm in their inquiries about her life on the farm. Then in 1993, the letters stopped. No explanation, no final message. Her parents made discreet inquiries through Richard's old military connections, but received only bureaucratic responses about classified assignments. Sophie continued to wear the dog tags, though she never showed them to anyone, not even her parents. As she grew older, the chain lengthened to accommodate her height, but the tags themselves remained a constant pressing against her skin, beneath her clothes, a reminder of the man who had changed her understanding of courage and commitment. Now, 8 years after Sullivan had driven away from Oakwood, Sophie twisted her bound wrists against the rough bark of the oak tree, rain soaking her to the skin as lightning illuminated the empty field around her. The rope cut deeper into Sophie's wrists as she struggled, the rain plastering her hair to her face and lightning periodically illuminating the empty field around her. The oak tree offered minimal shelter, its summer foliage long since thinned by autumn winds. Each gust sent icy water cascading down her back, and her fingers were growing numb from cold and restricted circulation. The cheap flip phone, her only lifeline, was clutched awkwardly in her bound hands behind the tree trunk. The support team that had taken over her call with Sullivan, identifying themselves only as tactical response, remained on the line, their voices calm and methodical as they asked questions about her exact location, physical condition, and immediate surroundings. Temperature is dropping, Sophie managed through chattering teeth. Maybe 40 degrees now. Rain's turning to sleet. Understood, the disembodied voice replied. Hypothermia risk increasing. Can you describe the restraints again? Sophie twisted her head, trying to see the ropes. Standard nylon rope, quarter-inch triple knotted. They used a lot around my wrist then, around the tree trunk, then around my waist. And the knife you mentioned, someone left a knife nearby. About 6 feet away, Sophie confirmed, squinting through the rain. On a rock, but it might have blown away by now. I can't see it anymore. Lightning split the sky directly overhead, followed almost instantly by a deafening crack of thunder that Sophie felt in her bones. The storm was intensifying, the wind now strong enough to bend smaller trees nearly double. The ancient oak groaned above her, its massive branches swaying alarmingly. Sophie, the voice on the phone said, using her name for the first time. I need you to focus on staying warm. Tuck your chin to your chest to conserve body heat. Keep wiggling your fingers and toes to maintain circulation. Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan and his team are en route, estimated arrival in 12 hours. 12 hours. Sophie's heart sank. The temperature was dropping by the minute, the rain showing no signs of letting up. 12 hours in these conditions would be a death sentence. I don't think I have 12 hours, she admitted, her voice small against the howling wind. There was a brief silence on the line. Understood. Local assets are being explored. Continue to... The voice cut off, suddenly replaced by static. Sophie's stomach dropped as she realized the cheap phone was losing signal in the storm. Hello, are you there? She called desperately, but the static only intensified before the line went dead completely. The phone screen flickered, then displayed a critical battery warning before going dark. Alone in the storm, Sophie fought against rising panic. Sullivan was coming, but too late. Her parents wouldn't miss her until dinner, and with the roads flooding, they might assume she was staying at a friend's house. No one knew where she was. No one except Sean, Melissa, and Dylan. The thought of her tormentors brought a surge of anger that temporarily cut through the cold. She twisted her wrists against the rope with renewed determination, ignoring the pain as the rough fibers scraped her skin raw. Sullivan had taught her never to give up, to use everything available to her advantage. What did she have? Rope that was getting soaked and might stretch a tree, with rough bark that might fray the fibers, and the knowledge that the human body was capable of more than most people believed possible. Sophie began methodically working her wrists up and down against the bark, using the tree itself as a saw against the rope. Each movement sent pain shooting up her arms, but she continued, remembering Sullivan's words, pain is information. Use it. Don't fear it. Time became meaningless, measured only in the rhythmic scrape of rope against bark and the decreasing feeling in her extremities. The cold was a living thing now, seeping into her bones, making each movement more difficult than the last. But still, she persisted, driven by a determination that went beyond mere survival. She would not be a victim. She would not be defeated by Sean Hayward or this storm. A particularly violent gust of wind sent a branch crashing down nearby, startling Sophie from her focused work. The sound of splintering wood was followed by an ominous creak from above. One of the oak's massive limbs was beginning to split, near the trunk, weakened by the relentless wind. If it fell, it would crush her. Sophie redoubled her efforts, desperation lending strength to her numbed arms. The rope felt looser now, whether from her sawing motion against the bark or from the water causing the fibers to expand. She couldn't tell, but it was something. With a final painful twist, one hand slipped free of the restraint. Sophie nearly cried out in relief, quickly working to free her other hand and then the rope around her waist. Her fingers, clumsy with cold, fumbled with the knots, but finally she was free. For a moment, she simply leaned against the tree, catching her breath and allowing blood to flow back into her hands, a process accompanied by excruciating pins and needles. Then the splitting sound from above intensified and Sophie threw herself away from the trunk, just as the massive branch came crashing down, landing exactly where she had been standing seconds before. The impact sent a shudder through the ground mud splashing up around Sophie as she lay sprawled in the flooded field. Rain lashed at her face as she struggled to her feet, disorientation momentarily overwhelming her. Which direction was home? In the darkness and driving rain, all landmarks had disappeared. Lightning flashed again briefly, illuminating the landscape. Sophie caught a glimpse of higher ground to her left, the rise that led toward Oakwood Farm. She began slogging in that direction, each step a battle against mud that sucked at her shoes and wine that threatened to knock her off her feet. The cold was becoming dangerous now. Sophie's wet clothes offered no protection against the wind chill, and her limbs were growing increasingly unresponsive. She knew the signs of hypothermia, confusion, loss of coordination, eventual drowsiness that would lead to unconsciousness and death if she succumbed to it. "Keep moving," she muttered aloud, forcing one foot in front of the other. "Just keep moving." A distant light caught her attention, headlights perhaps on the access road that ran alongside the field. Sophie changed course, hoping it might be her parents searching for her or even a stranger who could help. As she drew closer, she could make out the shape of a pickup truck, its headlights cutting twin beams through the rain. Two figures were moving away from it into the field, one heading toward the oak tree she had just escaped. "Hey!" Sophie shouted, but her voice was lost in the howling wind. She waved her arms and continued toward the light, stumbling as her foot caught in a hidden depression. The fall saved her life. As Sophie went down, a massive section of sheet metal, torn from a barn roof by the wind, went sailing through the air exactly where her head had been moments before. It struck the ground with enough force to embed itself 6 inches into the mud, vibrating like a giant tuning fork. Sophie lay still, stunned by her narrow escape, her heart pounding in her ears. The storm was becoming not just dangerous, but deadly, and she was still at least a quarter-mile from the road. Gathering herself, she rose again, more carefully this time, scanning for airborne debris. The lights from the truck were still visible, and she resumed her journey toward them, desperate for any human contact and assistance. She had covered perhaps 50 yards when another flash of lightning revealed a figure running toward her, someone who had spotted her and was coming to help. Relief flooded through Sophie, giving her a burst of energy. "Here," she called, waving her arms again. "I'm here." The figure drew closer, resolving into a familiar shape. Dylan Cooper, his face a mask of concern and guilt, beneath the hood of his rain jacket. "Sophie," he shouted when he was close enough to be heard over the storm. "Thank God you got free. Are you hurt?" Before she could answer, a second figure appeared beside him. Melissa Foster, her makeup streaked by rain, her expression shocked. "You're alive," Melissa said, as if she'd expected otherwise. "How did you—" "No time," Dylan interrupted, removing his rain jacket and wrapping it around Sophie's shoulders. "We need to get to the truck. This storm is getting worse by the minute." Sophie wanted to refuse their help. These were the people who had put her in danger in the first place, but survival instinct overrode pride. She allowed Dylan to support her as they made their way back toward the truck, Melissa following closely behind. "I'm sorry," Dylan said as they walked, his voice barely audible above the storm. "I should never have gone along with it. There's no excuse." Sophie didn't respond. Her energy was focused entirely on putting one foot in front of the other, fighting the cold that threatened to shut down her body systems. Conversation and forgiveness could wait. They had nearly reached the truck when a flash of lightning illuminated another vehicle approaching on the access road. A familiar red pickup with a lift kit and oversized tires, Sean Hayward's truck. "Oh no," Melissa whispered, fear evident in her voice. "He said he was staying home." The truck skidded to a halt beside Melissa's vehicle, and Sean emerged, his leather jacket offering little protection against the storm. His face, illuminated by the headlights, showed a mixture of anger and something else, fear perhaps, though whether for Sophie or himself wasn't clear. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted at Dylan and Melissa. "I told you to stay out of this." Dylan positioned himself between Sean and Sophie, his stance protective. "She could have died out here, Sean. Look at her, she's hypothermic." Sean's gaze shifted to Sophie, taking in her bedraggled appearance, the blue tinge to her lips, the violent shivering that racked her body despite Dylan's jacket. For a moment, something like regret flashed across his face. Then his expression hardened again. "She got herself free. She's fine. We need to go, all of us, before anyone connects us to this." "Connects us?" Melissa repeated incredulously. "Sean, we tied her to a tree in a tornado-level storm. That's attempted murder." It was a prank that got out of hand, Sean countered, rain streaming down his face. No one will believe her word against ours, but only if we stick together on this. He focused on Sophie again. We'll drive you home. You fell in the creek trying to cross it in the storm. That's what happened. Understand? Sophie stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. Even now, faced with the consequences of his actions, Sean was thinking only of himself. Go to hell, she managed through chattering teeth. Sean's face darkened. He took a step toward her, but Dylan moved to intercept him. Back off, Sean, Dylan warned. It's over. For a tense moment, it seemed Sean might escalate the confrontation. Then lightning struck a power line less than 50 yards away, sending a shower of sparks into the air and illuminating the scene with eerie blue light. Fine, Sean spat, retreating toward his truck. You want to throw everything away for Farm Girl? Your choice, but don't come crying when she ruins all our lives. He climbed into his pickup and gunned the engine, executing a reckless three-point turn that sent mud spraying from his tires before roaring off into the storm. We need to get her warm now, Dylan said, helping Sophie toward Melissa's truck. Crank the heat as high as it will go. Inside the cab, Sophie huddled in the passenger seat, shivering uncontrollably as Melissa turned the heater to maximum. The warm air felt like fire against her frozen skin, painful but necessary. Hospital or home? Melissa asked, putting the truck in drive. Sophie considered. The hospital would mean questions she wasn't ready to answer, especially with Sullivan and his team still hours away. Home, she decided. My parents can help. Melissa nodded, navigating carefully onto the flooded access road. The truck's headlights revealed water nearly axle-deep in places, but the vehicle was high enough to push through. I'm sorry, Melissa said suddenly, her eyes fixed on the road. I know that doesn't help, but I am. I got caught up in, I don't even know what. Being someone I'm not, I guess. Sophie said nothing, focusing on the warmth slowly returning to her extremities. The pain was excruciating as circulation returned, but with it came clarity of thought. She thought of Sean racing home to construct his alibi of Dylan and Melissa, risking Sean's wrath to come back for her, of her parents who would be frantic by now, and of Sullivan crossing continents to keep a promise made years ago. The storm continued to rage around them, but inside the truck, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that would change Millfield forever once it broke. Thousands of miles away in a classified location that wouldn't appear on any public map, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Sullivan lowered the secure phone from his ear and turned to the four men seated around a makeshift tactical table. Their faces, streaked with desert camouflage paint, showed no reaction to the sudden interruption of their mission briefing. Gentlemen, Sullivan said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command, we have a Protocol Omega situation. Wheels up in 20. Not one of the elite operators questioned the order or asked for details. Protocol Omega was rarely invoked, a special dispensation for operators with family emergencies requiring command-level authorization and an extension of service commitment in exchange for immediate extraction from the field. What few knew was that the protocol had a broader definition of family than blood relations alone. A Delta operator could designate up to 3 individuals for Omega protection people who, for whatever reason, the operator considered essential to their personal stability and mission readiness. 8 years ago, Sullivan had listed Sophie Miller as one of his 3. Authorization confirmed, the commander said, pushing a tablet across the desk for Sullivan's digital signature. Stipulation reminder, 6-month extension of current deployment cycle upon return. Sullivan signed without hesitation. 6 more months in this desert hellhole was nothing compared to breaking his promise to Sophie. You'll take your team, the commander asked, though it wasn't really a question. Delta operators functioned as a unit, their bonds forged through shared danger and absolute interdependence. Affirmative, Sullivan confirmed. We'll need transport to Ramstein, then commercial to States. Estimated time from wheels up to target location. The commander's fingers moved rapidly over his keyboard. 16 hours minimum, assuming weather cooperation at all points, which isn't looking promising. He turned the screen, showing a weather map of the Midwestern United States. Major system moving through your target area. High winds, potential tornado activity. Sullivan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. 16 hours. Sophie would be alone in that storm for 16 hours. Make it 12, he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. The commander studied him for a moment and then nodded. I'll see what I can do. Go brief your team. Outside the command center, four men waited with the patient stillness that marked elite operators the ability to conserve energy while remaining perfectly alert. Each carried a rucksack already packed with essential gear, ready for immediate deployment. Master Sergeant Miguel Ramirez, weapons specialist, was cleaning his fingernails with the tip of a knife that technically wasn't supposed to exist. Staff Sergeant James Cooper, the team medic, was reviewing something on a tablet, probably medical protocols for whatever situation they were heading into. Sergeant First Class David Mitchell, communications expert, was making minute adjustments to equipment. Only he fully understood. And Sergeant Eric Jensen, their transportation and infiltration specialist, was simply weighting his Midwestern features impassive. "Gentlemen," Sullivan addressed them without preamble, "we have a Protocol Omega situation, wheels up in 20. None of them asked for details. They didn't need to. Each man on the team had signed the same form designating their own Omega contacts. Each understood that whatever awaited them was personal to Sullivan, which made it personal to all of them. "Timeline," Cooper asked, already mentally cataloging what medical supplies might be needed. 12 hours to target," Sullivan replied. "Weather complications at the destination." "Loadout," Ramirez inquired, referring to what equipment they would bring. "Civilian compatible only. We're entering a domestic environment." Sullivan's expression remained neutral, but his team knew him well enough to recognize the tension in his shoulders. "This is strictly volunteer. Anyone who stays behind will face no repercussions." Jensen snorted, breaking the tension. "With respect, sir, that's bullshit and you know it. Where you go, we go." The others nodded in agreement, already moving to prepare for departure. No further discussion was needed. Sullivan turned to Jensen as the others dispersed. "You're from Ohio, originally, correct?" Jensen's eyebrow raised slightly. "Yes, sir. Small town outside Columbus." "Why?" "Our destination is Millfield. Does that mean anything to you?" A shadow crossed Jensen's usually stoic face. "Millfield County. Yes, sir. I know it well. My family had a farm there until 1998. Had Agritech bought it after my father died. My mother couldn't manage alone." Jensen's tone remained professional, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. Thomas Hayward was the company representative who handled the purchase. Offered 30% below market value, knowing she had no choice. Sullivan processed this information, filing it away. "Thomas Hayward is still there now, regional director for Agritech." Jensen's eyes narrowed slightly. "Is he relevant to our mission, sir?" "Potentially. His son is involved in the situation." Understanding dawned on Jensen's face. "Like father, like son, I'm guessing." Sullivan didn't confirm or deny, but his silence was answer enough. "Be ready in 15, he said instead, turning to make his own preparations. As the team dispersed to gather their gear, Sullivan took a moment alone, removing a worn photograph from his wallet. It showed a much younger version of himself standing beside a small blonde girl in overalls, both of them smiling, beneath the spreading branches of an oak tree. He studied it briefly, then returned it to his wallet with a renewed sense of purpose. 16 hours was too long, but it was all they had. In the eastern field of Oakwood Farm, the ancient oak tree groaned under the assault of the storm, one of its massive branches now lying broken where Sophie had been bound. The ropes that had held her hung loose, whipping in the wind like angry snakes. But Sophie Miller was gone, making her way home through the tempest, unaware that her call for help had set in motion events that would change not only her life, but the future of Millfield itself. As lightning split the sky, once more illuminating the solitary oak, a promise made 8 years ago resonated across continents, carried on the storm winds. "If you ever truly need me, I'll find a way to help you." Lieutenant Colonel Michael Sullivan, one of America's most elite special operators, was coming to keep that promise. And neither storm, nor distance, nor the powers that be in Millfield would stand in his way. Robert Miller stood at the kitchen window of Oakwood Farm, watching the storm lash at the fields he had worked his entire life. Helen moved behind him, the portable radio in her hand, broadcasting the latest weather updates. "Flash flood warning extended until midnight." The announcer's voice crackled through static. "Residents in low-lying areas are advised to seek higher ground immediately. Power outages reported throughout Millfield County." "She should have been home hours ago," Helen said, worry etching lines in her face. "I've tried the school, but the phones are down." Robert's jaw tightened, his calloused hands gripping the windowsill. "Roads are flooded. Maybe she stayed with a friend in town." Neither of them voiced the fear that grew with each passing minute, that their daughter was caught somewhere in the most violent storm to hit Millfield in decades. The sound of an engine outside drew them both to the door. Through sheets of rain, headlights approached up the long driveway, moving slowly through standing water that had transformed their yard into a shallow lake. "That's not our truck," Robert observed, grabbing a flashlight and rain gear. "Stay here, I'll check." But Helen was already following him out onto the porch, rain immediately soaking through her sweater. "It could be news about Sophie," she said, her tone brooking no argument. Together they watched as a pickup truck they didn't recognize pulled up to the house. The passenger door opened and a figure emerged, small and bedraggled, but unmistakably their daughter. "Sophie!" Helen cried, rushing down the porch steps, heedless of the rain and floodwater. Robert was right behind her, reaching Sophie just as the girl's legs seemed to give out. He caught her lifting her easily despite his age, alarmed at how cold she felt even through her wet clothes. "Inside now," he ordered, carrying Sophie toward the house, while Helen hurried ahead to prepare blankets and hot water. Dylan and Melissa followed hesitantly, stopping at the foot of the porch steps. "She needs to get warm," Dylan called over the storm. "She's been outside for hours." Robert paused, taking in these strangers who had brought his daughter home. Questions burned in his mind, but they could wait. "Come inside," he said gruffly. "Storm's too bad to drive back." Inside the old farmhouse was a flurry of activity. Helen had already laid blankets before the wood stove in the living room and was heating water for tea. Robert placed Sophie gently on the couch, alarmed at her blue-tinged lips and violent shivering. "What happened?" he demanded, turning to Dylan and Melissa, who hovered uncertainly in the doorway. The two teenagers exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. It was Dylan who spoke first. "She was tied to the oak tree in the east field," he said, his voice steady despite the bomb he was dropping. "We just found her and brought her home." Robert's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flashed in his eyes. He repeated the single word, carrying the weight of a threat. Melissa stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "Sean Hayward did it. We helped him. It was wrong and we're sorry, but right now Sophie needs medical attention." Helen gasped, nearly dropping the kettle she was carrying. "You tied my daughter to a tree in this storm." Sophie stirred on the couch, her eyes opening. "Mom," she managed, her voice weak. "I'm okay. Just cold." Helen set down the kettle and knelt beside her daughter, the maternal instinct temporarily overriding her shock and anger. "We need to get these wet clothes off you," she said, already working to remove Sophie's soaked jacket. "Robert, bring my thermal pajamas from upstairs and call Dr. Matthews." Robert hesitated, clearly torn between caring for his daughter and dealing with the teenagers who had admitted to endangering her life. Finally, he nodded curtly and headed for the stairs, pausing beside Dylan and Melissa. "You two stay right here," he said, his farmer's hands capable of gentle care for newborn animals and bruising force when necessary clenching at his sides. "We're not done talking about this." As Robert disappeared upstairs, Helen continued helping Sophie out of her wet clothes, wrapping her in warm blankets. Her nursing training from years before took over, her movements efficient despite the trembling of her hands. "How long were you out there?" she asked, rubbing Sophie's arms through the blankets to generate friction heat. "Few hours," Sophie murmured, her teeth still chattering. "Got free when a branch fell." Helen's eyes widened in horror at the implications. If the branch had fallen differently. "The phones are down, Naho," Melissa offered hesitantly. "But I have a satellite phone in my truck. My dad makes me carry it for emergencies." Helen looked up, momentarily surprised by the offer from one of her daughter's tormentors. "Get it," she ordered. "We need to call Dr. Matthews." As Melissa hurried out to her truck, Dylan remained in the doorway, his expression a mixture of guilt and concern. "I left a knife," he said, addressing Sophie directly. "I thought you'd be able to reach it. I'm sorry it wasn't closer." Sophie managed a weak nod, neither accepting nor rejecting his apology. Her mind was on something else entirely. "Mom," she said, her voice slightly stronger as warmth began returning to her body. "I called someone before I got free. He's coming." Helen frowned, tucking the blankets more securely around her daughter. "Who, sweetheart? Who did you call?" Sophie's eyes drifted closed, exhaustion claiming her now that she was safe. "Mike," she whispered. "Mike Sullivan." Helen froze her hand on Sophie's forehead. She exchanged a look with Dylan, who seemed confused by the name, then glanced toward the stairs where Robert was returning with clothes and a first aid kit. "Robert," she called, her voice strained. "She called Mike." Robert paused on the last step, understanding immediately. Mike's fought for how when? I don't know, Helen replied, turning back to Sophie, who had drifted into an exhausted sleep. But she says he's coming. Outside, the storm continued to rage, unaware that it was no longer the most dangerous force converging on Millfield. Somewhere over the Atlantic, a military transport plane carrying 5 Delta Force operators was fighting through the same weather system, racing against time to reach a small Ohio town where promises made would finally be kept. The Hayward estate stood on 10 manicured acres at the edge of the new development north of Millfield. Unlike the weathered farmhouses that had dotted the county for generations, the Hayward home was a modern colonial 6,000 square feet of brick and columns with a circular driveway leading to an imposing front entrance. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a landscape garden where no vegetable had ever been grown, no chicken had ever scratched, no real work had ever been done. Inside, Sean Hayward's footsteps echoed on Italian marble as he entered the cavernous foyer, tossing his muddied football cleats onto a bench worth more than most families' monthly mortgage payments. Practice had been moved indoors due to the approaching storm, cutting short the drills he'd been counting on to sharpen his performance for the scout visit. Now that visit was postponed indefinitely, and his father would not be pleased. Bradley, is that you? His mother's voice drifted from somewhere upstairs, present but distant, like everything else about Victoria Hayward. Yeah, Mom. Sean didn't break stride as he headed for the kitchen, where Maria, their housekeeper, would have left his protein shake in the refrigerator. Victoria appeared at the top of the curved staircase, immaculate in designer loungewear, a glass of white wine in her manicured hand, despite the early hour. Your father called. He's bringing the Ohio State recruiter to dinner tonight instead of the game. Sean froze the refrigerator door half open. Tonight here. Yes, Maria's preparing steaks. Wear something presentable, please. She gestured vaguely at his practice clothes before disappearing back into her wing of the house. Sean leaned against the granite countertop, a cold weight settling in his stomach that had nothing to do with the protein shake. A private dinner meant private evaluation. No crowd cheering his name, no highlight reel of touchdown passes, just Thomas Hayward's critical eyes across the dining table, measuring his son against impossible standards. The massive kitchen, with its professional-grade appliances and custom cabinetry, suddenly felt confining. Sean left his shake unfinished and climbed the stairs to his bedroom suite, passing walls adorned with his football trophies and framed newspaper clippings, celebrating Millfield's golden arm. His bedroom was a shrine to athletic achievement shelves lined with trophies, walls covered with pennants and team photos. A signed Ohio State jersey hung in a display case, a gift from his father intended as both inspiration and expectation. Sean sank onto the edge of his king-size bed, staring at the framed photograph on his nightstand, himself at age 7, standing rigid in a suit beside his father at some political function. Even then, Thomas's hand had rested on his shoulder like a weight rather than a comfort. 18 years of his life, and Sean Hayward had never known what it meant to fail. Not because he had never failed, but because in the Hayward household, failure wasn't acknowledged. It was erased, covered up, or punished until it disappeared from view. Thomas Hayward had returned from Desert Storm with a Bronze Star and an unshakable conviction that the world belonged to the strong. His military bearing never softened, not even when he removed the uniform. He'd parlayed his war record into political capital, winning a seat on the town council before forging connections with Agritech that led to his current position as regional director. The Hayward legacy. Thomas often reminded his son, is built on strength. Weakness is a choice, and we don't make that choice. As a child, Sean had learned that lesson through rigorous physical training, beginning with 5 a.m. runs at age 8. As a teenager, he'd learned it through the unyielding criticism that met any performance short of excellence, whether on the football field or in the classroom. And on the rare occasions when the criticism escalated to physical discipline, he'd learned to stand straight, take the belt without flinching, and respond with a sharp, "Yes, sir." Sean's phone buzzed with an incoming text from Melissa. "Did you do it, farm girl? Learn her lesson?" Sean hesitated, then typed back, "Mission accomplished." Left her tied to a tree in the east field. She'll have plenty of time to reconsider her attitude. Melissa's reply came quickly. "OMG in this storm, savage." The praise should have felt good. Instead, an unfamiliar discomfort settled in Sean's chest as he stared at the message. The storm was intensifying beyond what had been forecast. He could hear it now, wind lashing against his windows, rain beating a tattoo on the roof. Another text arrived, this one from Dylan. Dude, this storm is insane. We should go back for her. Sean's jaw tightened. He'd expected this from Dylan, who'd been reluctant from the start. Dylan Cooper, with his second-hand clothes and scholarship hopes, who'd latched onto Sean as protection from the very torment Sean inflicted on others. Dylan, who'd grown up in the trailer park, but sat at the popular table because of his friendship with Sean. Dylan, who never quite understood the rules of power. She'll be fine, Sean texted back. Don't go soft on me now. He tossed the phone aside and walked to his window, watching the storm rage across the manicured lawn. Lightning illuminated the swimming pool and tennis court luxuries his father had installed, not because Sean wanted them, but because they were appropriate for a man of Thomas Hayward's position. Behind these impressive symbols of success, the Hayward household operated on fear. Victoria drank to cope with her husband's volatile temper. The staff turnover was constant, as no housekeeper or groundskeeper lasted long under Thomas's exacting standards. And Sean, the golden son, the star quarterback, the heir to the Hayward legacy, wore his confidence like armor, hiding the brittle insecurity beneath. Last night, Thomas had summoned Sean to his home office after reviewing his son's latest academic progress report. Your English grade is slipping, Thomas had observed, not looking up from the paper. B- is unacceptable. Coaches says I need to focus on football right now with the scout coming. Sean had offered his explanation, standing at attention before his father's desk, a posture ingrained since childhood. And what is Sophie Miller's grade in English? Thomas asked, finally meeting his son's eyes. The question had caught Sean off guard. What's Sophie Miller, Robert Miller's daughter? The farm girl. What is her grade? I don't know, sir. An A, probably. She's a brain. An A+, Thomas interrupted, tossing a different paper onto the desk. Principal Morris shared the academic rankings with the board. She's top of your class. A girl who milks cows before school is outperforming my son. The humiliation had burned through Sean, followed quickly by defensive anger. Those types just study all the time. They don't have social lives, or they have work ethic. Thomas cut him off again, rising to face his son directly. When I was your age, I was already enlisted, earning top marks in training while carrying a full pack in the Georgia heat. Meanwhile, you're letting some dirt farmer's daughter show you up in a classroom with air conditioning. The comparison hung in the air between them, as it always did. Sean's comfortable life against Thomas's military sacrifice. Sean's athletic achievements against Thomas's Bronze Star. Sean's academic performance against Thomas's rise through the ranks of both military and civilian leadership. I expect better, Thomas had concluded, dismissing his son with a wave. Don't embarrass me in front of the Ohio State recruiter. Now, as thunder shook the house, Sean's phone buzzed again. A text from his father. Dinner at 7:00. Wear your letter jacket and remember Haywards don't lose. Sean stared at the message, then back out at the storm. Somewhere out there, Sophie Miller was tied to a tree, rain soaking her clothes, wind whipping around her. He had put her there to punish her for outshining him, for threatening the narrative of superiority his father had constructed. A flash of doubt crossed his mind. What if the storm was worse than predicted? What if no one found her until morning? He pushed the thought away. Sophie wasn't his problem. She was a chess piece in the game. His father had taught him to play a game where power was the only currency that mattered, and those without it were merely obstacles to be removed. Sean turned from the window and headed to his closet to select a shirt for dinner. The recruiter from Ohio State would be impressed. His father would be satisfied, at least temporarily. The Hayward legacy would continue, and if there was a cost to be paid for maintaining that legacy, someone else would pay it. That was the way of the world, according to Thomas Hayward, and Sean had learned his lessons well. The C-17 Globemaster III military transport plane fought its way through turbulence that threatened to shake the aircraft apart. Designed to deliver troops and cargo under combat conditions, it was being pushed to its operational limits by the massive storm system that stretched from the Midwest to the eastern seaboard. In the cargo hold, converted to Spartan passenger seating for this mission, Sullivan sat with his back against the fuselage, eyes closed but fully alert. Across from him, his team maintained similar postures of controlled rest, conserving energy while remaining ready for immediate action. The intercom crackled to life, the pilot's voice barely audible over the aircraft's straining engines. Lieutenant Colonel, we're diverting to Wright-Patterson. Storms made Columbus a no-go, ETA 90 minutes. Sullivan acknowledged the update with a thumbs up to the loadmaster who relayed the message forward. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton would add time to their journey to Millfield, but it was still their best option given the deteriorating weather. Sergeant Jensen, who had been studying weather maps on a tablet, looked up at the announcement. Sir, latest radar shows the system intensifying over Millfield County. Flash flood warnings, possible tornado activity. Sullivan's expression remained impassive, but his eyes, when they opened, carried an intensity that his team recognized all too well. Time from Wright-Pat to target location by ground. 3 hours minimum in these conditions, Jensen replied. Assuming roads are passable, which satellite imagery suggests they're not. Sullivan processed this information with the efficiency of a combat veteran who had spent decades making critical decisions under pressure. Options. Master Sergeant Ramirez leaned forward. We could requisition a helicopter at Wright-Pat, sir. Get as close as the weather allows, then finish on ground transport. Weather's not going to allow much, Staff Sergeant Cooper, the medic, interjected. Ceilings too low, winds too high. Bird would be grounded. Sir Sergeant Mitchell, the communications specialist, spoke up from where he had been monitoring a secure channel. I've been in contact with tactical response. They lost connection with the girl about an hour ago. Phone battery died. Last update indicated she had freed herself from restraints, but was showing signs of moderate hypothermia. A muscle in Sullivan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sophie was free, but alone in the storm, her condition deteriorating, and they were still hours away. Jensen, Sullivan said after a moment, you said you were from the area. Any contacts who might be able to help local law enforcement emergency services? Jensen shook his head. Sheriff's Department is understaffed and overwhelmed during normal conditions. In a storm like this, they'll be lucky to handle the major emergencies, and my family connections there ended when we lost the farm. Sullivan nodded, having expected this answer. Small towns like Millfield often had limited resources, and those would be stretched to breaking during a natural disaster. There is one option, sir, Jensen added hesitantly, but you won't like it. Sullivan's gaze sharpened. Let's hear it. Thomas Hayward, former Army, served in Desert Storm, now some kind of corporate executive and local politician. He has resources, equipment, manpower, influence. If anyone in Millfield could reach a stranded girl in this storm, it would be him. Hayward, Sullivan repeated the name, stirring something in his memory. Robert Miller mentioned him once, said he came back from the war with ambitions. Jensen nodded. That's putting it mildly, sir. He basically runs the town now. He hesitated again, clearly uncomfortable. Speak freely, Sergeant. Well, sir, from what you've told us, it sounds like Hayward's son is involved in whatever happened to the Miller girl. Going to Thomas Hayward for help might be complicated. Sullivan absorbed this, his mind working through the implications. Complicated is what we do, Jensen. Make the call when we land. Use your family connection as the angle. Say nothing about our mission or the Miller girl, just that you're returning to check on old neighbors during the storm and heard there might be people stranded in the eastern fields. Jensen nodded, understanding the strategy. Give Hayward a chance to help or to reveal himself as an obstacle. Ramirez, when we land, secure ground transportation that can handle flood conditions. Cooper, prep medical supplies for hypothermia treatment. Mitchell, keep working tactical response. See if they can get satellite imagery of the Miller farm and surrounding area. Each man acknowledges orders with a nod. No further discussion needed. This was how Delta Force operated. Clear objectives, adaptable tactics, absolute trust in each team member's capabilities. As the others turned to their tasks, Sullivan removed a waterproof case from his rucksack. Inside, protected from the elements, was a worn photograph himself and a much younger Sophie Miller, standing beneath the oak tree where she had now been left to die. The image had traveled with him through war zones and black operations across 4 continents, a reminder of a promise made to a child who had shown him kindness when he needed it most. 8 years of classified missions had taught Michael Sullivan the true meaning of patience. Now strapped into a military transport fighting through the worst storm system to hit the Midwest in decades, he found himself drawing on that same reserve of calm determination. He would reach Sophie, he would keep his promise. And those responsible would learn that some actions have consequences that no amount of local influence could prevent. The Oakwood farmhouse kitchen had become a center of activity as the night progressed. Robert had rigged up the generator to power essential systems, including the satellite phone that now sat on the table, its battery charging. Helen had prepared a simple meal of soup and homemade bread, insisting that everyone eat to keep up their strength. Sophie, wrapped in blankets and propped up on the couch, managed a few spoonfuls before exhaustion claimed her again. Dylan and Melissa ate silently at the kitchen table, the weight of the evening's events and tomorrow's consequences heavy on their young shoulders. Sheriff Potter says he'll meet us at the station at 8, Robert reported, hanging up the satellite phone after his latest call. Roads should be passable by then, at least the main ones. Helen nodded, clearing dishes with the efficiency of a woman accustomed to managing household crises. And Sophie's call? Any word on when Mike might arrive? Robert shook his head. Tactical response confirmed his team is en route, but the storm is causing delays. They've been diverted to Wright-Patterson. Right, Pat? Dylan asked, looking up from his bowl. The Air Force Base, Robert nodded, studying the boy with newfound interest. You know it? My uncle was stationed there, Dylan explained. Air Force mechanic. It's about 3 hours from here in good weather. And this isn't good weather, Robert concluded grimly, glancing toward the windows where rain continued to lash against the glass. We should all try to get some rest. Tomorrow will be challenging. As they prepared makeshift beds in the living room for their unexpected guests, the phone rang again. Helen answered, her expression shifting from concern to confusion. It's for you, Dylan, she said, holding out the receiver. Your mother. Dylan took the phone, his face paling. Mom, how did you know I was here? The conversation that followed was brief and one-sided, with Dylan mostly listening and occasionally saying, yes, ma'am, or I understand. When he hung up, he looked shell-shocked. What is it? Melissa asked, recognizing his expression. My mom got a call from Sean's father, Dylan explained. Mr. Hayward is telling people I stole Sean's truck and convinced you to go on some joyride during the storm that we're making up stories about Sean to cover for the theft. Robert's weathered face hardened. Thomas Hayward is getting ahead of the story, controlling the narrative. But it's not true, Melissa protested. We came in my truck, not Sean's, and we have Sophie's testimony about what really happened. Truth, Robert said with the weary wisdom of a man who had seen justice miscarried before, doesn't always win against power in places like Millfield. But, he added, his tone shifting, Thomas Hayward doesn't know what's coming. Dylan looked confused, but Melissa seemed to grasp the implication. Mike Sullivan, she said softly. The military man Sophie called. Robert nodded, a grim satisfaction in his eyes. Mike isn't influenced by local politics or corporate donations, and he keeps his promises. Outside, the storm began to diminish, the howling wind gradually subsiding to a steady gust, the pounding rain softening to a persistent drizzle. Nature's fury was abating, but the human storm brewing in Millfield was just beginning to gather strength. Dawn broke over Millfield County, revealing the storm's devastation in stark morning light. Fields lay submerged under feet of standing water. Uprooted trees blocked rural roads. Power lines drooped dangerously close to flooded areas. At Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Sullivan and his team emerged from the military transport into the gray morning, each carrying a standard-issue duffel that contained anything but standard equipment. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of men who had operated together in far more hostile environments than a storm-ravaged Ohio countryside. A young Air Force lieutenant approached, saluting sharply. Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan, your transportation is ready, sir. Sullivan returned the salute. What's the situation on the ground? Flooding throughout the region, sir. Major roads are mostly clear, but rural roads are hit or miss. We've provided the vehicle you requested, high-clearance four-wheel drive with emergency equipment. GPS is programmed with your destination. The lieutenant hesitated, then added, Sir, local authorities have established emergency protocols. Civilian movement is restricted in the worst-hit areas. Sullivan nodded, unsurprised. We'll coordinate with local emergency services as needed. Thank you, Lieutenant. The vehicle turned out to be a modified Humvee with civilian markings, less conspicuous than a military vehicle, but equally capable of handling the challenging conditions they would face. Jensen took the wheel, his familiarity with the region making him the natural choice as driver. As they cleared the base perimeter and headed east toward Millfield, Mitchell monitored communications on a specialized device that looked like a standard tablet, but could access both civilian and military networks. Sir, he reported after several minutes, I've been monitoring local emergency channels. Sheriff's Department in Millfield is reporting multiple rescue operations underway, mostly in the western part of the county. Eastern section, including our target area, is currently without power or standard communications. Sullivan processed this information, his mind mapping contingencies. Any mentions of the Miller farm or our persons of interest? Nothing specific, sir, but there's chatter about a local official named Hayward coordinating private resources for recovery efforts. Jensen's hands tightened on the steering wheel. That would be Thomas Hayward, sir, building his image as the town's savior, no doubt. Sullivan's expression remained neutral, but a cold calculation was taking place behind his eyes. Thomas Hayward was positioning himself as essential to the recovery, which meant any action against his son would have political implications for the entire community. Cooper, Sullivan addressed the medic. Based on the last report, what's your assessment of Sophie Miller's condition? Staff Sergeant Cooper considered carefully. If she found shelter and warmth shortly after the phone died, she should be stable. Moderate hypothermia is treatable with basic measures. The concerning factors would be any injuries sustained during her escape or exposure to contaminated floodwater. Sullivan nodded, then turned to Ramirez. When we arrive, we maintain civilian cover. No weapons visible, no military terminology. We're old friends of the Miller family, returning to help after the storm. And if we encounter resistance, sir? Ramirez asked the question, covering a multitude of possible scenarios. We handle it appropriately, Sullivan replied, his tone making it clear that appropriately would be determined by the specific threat posed. Our primary objective is confirming Sophie's safety. Secondary objective is ensuring accountability for those responsible. The team understood the implicit order. They would not be seeking extrajudicial revenge, but neither would they allow local politics or influence to obstruct justice. As they approached the Millfield County line, Jensen slowed the vehicle, pointing ahead to where water covered the roadway. First obstacle, sir, about 2 feet deep from the markers. Sullivan assessed the situation. Proceed with caution. Mitchell marked this location on our map. If conditions worsen, we may need alternative routes for extraction. The Humvee forged through the water with minimal difficulty, its specialized systems designed for far worse conditions than a flooded country road. Beyond the water hazard, they encountered their first signs of human activity, a county maintenance truck with workers clearing a fallen tree. Jensen slowed as they passed, exchanging nods with the workers, who barely gave their vehicle a second glance, assuming it was part of the emergency response. As they drew closer to Millfield proper, the devastation became more evident. The new housing development on the north side of town had been largely spared due to its elevated position, but the older sections near the creek showed signs of significant flooding. Main Street was visible in the distance, its buildings intact but surrounded by standing water and debris. Sir, Mitchell spoke up. I've got a signal from the Miller farm. Satellite phone activated approximately 20 minutes ago. Sullivan felt a surge of relief, though his expression remained composed. A working satellite phone meant someone at the farm was conscious and functional, hopefully Sophie herself. Make contact, he ordered. Identify yourself by my name only. Verify Sophie's condition and our ETA. Mitchell complied, his voice professional as he established contact. The conversation was brief, and when he lowered the phone, his expression was grim. Sir, that was Robert Miller. He confirms Sophie is stable, but reports a complication. Thomas Hayward has apparently filed charges against Dylan Cooper for vehicle theft and reckless endangerment. Sheriff's deputies are on their way to the farm now to take the boy into custody. Sullivan's jaw tightened. Damage control. Hayward's getting the accusers out of the way before they can make official statements. There's more, sir, Mitchell continued. Robert Miller says Hayward is personally leading a community aid convoy to their area this morning, bringing supplies, generators, and media coverage. How convenient, Jensen muttered. The hero arrives just in time for the cameras. Sullivan considered this development, his tactical mind, analyzing angles and opportunities. Timing. Deputies expected within 30 minutes. Hayward's convoy within the hour. ETA. Jensen checked the GPS. 28 minutes, sir, assuming no further road hazards. Sullivan made his decision. We'll proceed directly to the Miller farm. I want to be there when the deputies arrive. He turned to Jensen. You know the fastest route, even if it's not the one on GPS. Yes, sir. There's a service road that cuts through the Miller property. Might shave off 5 minutes. Take it. Sullivan turned to address the team. When we arrive, I'll make initial contact. Cooper, you assess Sophie's condition. Ramirez, Mitchell, secure the perimeter and monitor approaching vehicles. Jensen, you'll need to stay out of sight initially. Your connection to Hayward might complicate matters. Each man acknowledged his assignment with a nod. The vehicle accelerated slightly as Jensen turned onto a narrower road bypassing the town center entirely. Michael Sullivan had participated in hostage rescues, counterterrorism operations, and high-value target extractions across the globe. But this mission, protecting a 16-year-old girl from small-town politics and power, carried a personal weight that none of those other operations had ever approached. 8 years ago, he had made a promise to Sophie Miller. Today, he would keep it, regardless of the cost. Sophie Miller sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot tea, a blanket still draped over her shoulders despite the warmth of the farmhouse. The morning light streaming through the windows revealed the toll of her ordeal. Dark circles beneath her eyes. Rope burns on her wrists, now properly bandaged, a pallor to her skin that spoke of physical and emotional exhaustion. Across from her, Dylan and Melissa sat in uncomfortable silence, their own fatigue evident in slumped shoulders and hollow eyes. Helen Miller moved efficiently around the kitchen, preparing a substantial breakfast that no one had much appetite for, while Robert paced near the window, watching the driveway with increasing tension. They should be here soon, he said, checking his watch for the third time in as many minutes. Sheriff Potter said he'd send deputies to take statements. And to arrest me, Dylan added quietly, his voice resigned. My mom called again. Mr. Hayward is pressing charges for stealing Sean's truck. A truck you never touched, Sophie pointed out, anger briefly overcoming her exhaustion. We'll tell them the truth, Melissa said. The truth, Dylan said bitterly, doesn't seem to matter much against the Hayward version of events. Robert turned from the window, his expression somber. In my experience, the truth always matters. It just doesn't always win right away. The satellite phone on the counter chirped, drawing everyone's attention. Robert answered it, his posture straightening as he listened. How far out, he asked, then nodded at the response. We'll be ready. As he hung up, he turned to the room with renewed purpose. That was Mike's team. They'll be here in 15 minutes. He focused on Dylan and Melissa. You two need to understand something. When Mike Sullivan arrives, everything changes. He's not just some old army buddy. He's the kind of soldier that even other soldiers talk about in whispers. What does that mean? Dylan asked, confusion evident on his tired face. It means, Helen interjected, wiping her hands on a dish towel, that you're about to meet someone who doesn't play by the same rules as Thomas Hayward. And that's a good thing. Sophie's fingers tightened around her mug. Mike won't hurt anyone, she said with certainty. He's coming to help, not to punish. Of course, Robert agreed, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. But his presence alone will change the dynamics in Millfield. Thomas Hayward may run this town, but men like Mike, they operate on a different level entirely. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching, not from the main road, but from the service path that cut across the back of the property. Robert moved quickly to the rear window, his expression shifting from concern to recognition. It's them, he confirmed, and they beat the sheriff's deputies. Good. The vehicle that pulled up behind the farmhouse bore no military markings, but its capabilities were evident in the ease with which it navigated the muddy, debris-strewn path. 5 men emerged, moving with a coordinated precision that marked them immediately as something other than civilian disaster relief. The leader, a tall figure whose bearing commanded attention despite his nondescript clothing, surveyed the farmhouse with a practiced eye before approaching the back door. Robert was already moving to meet him. The kitchen door opened, and Lieutenant Colonel Michael Sullivan stepped into the Miller farmhouse for the first time in 8 years. His appearance had changed, more lines around his eyes, a few strands of gray at his temples, his build more solid than the recovering, wounded soldier who had once spent a summer here. But his presence, that indefinable quality that had always set him apart, remained unchanged. His gaze swept the room, assessing and cataloging in the way that had become second nature after decades of special operations. Then his eyes found Sophie, and for a brief moment the hardened Delta Force commander gave way to the man who had once taught a young girl about courage and promises. Sophie, he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of both authority and genuine concern. Sophie rose from her chair, the blanket falling from her shoulders as she crossed the kitchen in quick steps. Without hesitation, she threw her arms around Sullivan's waist, burying her face against his chest, in a gesture that bridged the 8-year gap as if it had never existed. Sullivan's arms closed around her, one hand gently cupping the back of her head in a protective gesture that seemed at odds with his otherwise military bearing. "I told you I'd come if you called," he said quietly. "I never doubted it," Sophie replied, her voice muffled against his jacket. "Not for a second." For those watching, Robert and Helen Dillon and Melissa and the 4 operators who had followed Sullivan into the kitchen, the moment carried a power that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. This was not just a rescue. It was the fulfillment of a promise that had sustained both the giver and the receiver through years of separation. The moment was broken by the sound of vehicles on the main driveway, the sheriff's deputies arriving as predicted. Sullivan released Sophie gently, his demeanor shifting back to operational mode in an instant. "Cooper, he addressed the medic who had followed him in. "Check her condition. Mitchell, monitor the approaching vehicles. Ramirez, secure our transport. Jensen, stay out of sight until I call for you." The men moved to comply without question, each understanding his role in the unfolding scenario. Sullivan turned to Robert Miller, extending his hand in a gesture that acknowledged their shared history and concern for Sophie. "Robert," he said, his tone respectful, "we have about 2 minutes before those deputies reach your door. I need to know exactly what we're dealing with." Robert clasped Sullivan's hand firmly. "Thomas Hayward's son tied Sophie to a tree during the worst of the storm, left her to die. Now Hayward's trying to cover it up by having one of the witnesses arrested on false charges." Sullivan absorbed this information with a slight narrowing of his eyes, the only outward sign of the cold fury building within him. He turned to Dillon. "You're the one they're coming for." Dillon nodded, swallowing nervously under Sullivan's intense gaze. "Yes, sir. They're saying that I stole Sean's truck, but I never touched it. I was trying to help Sophie." Sullivan studied the boy for a moment, then nodded once, apparently satisfied with what he saw. "You did the right thing coming back for her. That counts for something." Before Dillon could respond, a sharp knock sounded at the front door. Robert moved to answer it, but Sullivan held up a hand to stop him. "Let me," he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. "Cooper, stay with Sophie. The rest of you let me do the talking." As Sullivan moved through the farmhouse toward the front door, his posture and demeanor subtly shifted. To the casual observer, he might have appeared to be simply a concerned family friend. But those who knew what to look for would recognize the controlled readiness, the calculated assessment of terrain and angles, the precise positioning that gave him both visual coverage and tactical advantage. Michael Sullivan opened the door to face the deputies of Millfield County, his expression pleasant but unreadable. Behind him, unseen but present, stood the full weight of his training, experience, and authority, a force that Thomas Hayward, for all his local power, had never encountered and could not possibly be prepared for. The confrontation that would reshape Millfield was about to begin. The morning sun crept over the horizon as Michael Sullivan opened the Wilson farmhouse door to face 2 Millfield County Sheriff's deputies. They stood on the porch, uniforms crisp despite the muddy conditions, hands resting casually near their holsters. "Morning, officers," Sullivan said, his voice neutral but carrying an unmistakable authority. The older deputies straightened slightly, instinctively responding to the command presence. "We're here for Dylan Cooper. Got a warrant for his arrest, vehicle theft, and reckless endangerment." Sullivan stepped fully onto the porch, closing the door behind him. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Michael Sullivan, U.S. Army Special Operations. Before you proceed, I need to inform you that this situation involves multiple jurisdictions and potential federal interest." The younger deputy frowned. "Sir, with all due respect, we have a valid warrant signed by Judge Morris." "I understand," Sullivan replied, "and I'm not questioning your authority. I'm merely suggesting we coordinate our efforts." He withdrew a small leather case from his pocket, flipping it open to reveal military credentials that made both deputies blink in surprise. "The girl inside was the victim of a serious crime last night. My team is here as part of an ongoing investigation. I propose we contact Sheriff Potter directly before proceeding." 20 minutes later, Sheriff Potter's cruiser pulled up to the farmhouse, followed by an Agritech SUV carrying Thomas Hayward. The scene on the porch had evolved. Sullivan's team had taken strategic positions around the property, while Robert Miller stood shoulder to shoulder with Sullivan. Thomas Hayward emerged from his vehicle, every inch the commanding figure in his tailored suit. His confident stride faltered only slightly when he recognized Sullivan, a brief flash of Desert Storm memories crossing his face. "Mike Sullivan," Hayward said, extending his hand. "It's been years. What brings Delta Force to our little town?" Sullivan ignored the hand. "Sophie Miller brought me here. She called me after your son tied her to a tree and left her to die in that storm." Hayward's politician's smile never wavered. "That's a serious accusation. My son tells a different story about joyriding teens stealing his truck." "I have something better than stories," Sullivan replied, nodding to Mitchell, who stepped forward with a satellite phone. "A recorded emergency call from Sophie made while she was still tied to that tree, plus documentation of her injuries, witness statements, and physical evidence from the scene." Sheriff Potter, a solid man with 30 years of law enforcement experience, listened to a portion of the recording, his weathered face hardening. "Mr. Hayward, I believe we need to reconsider the charges against the Cooper boy." "This is ridiculous," Hayward blustered. "One hysterical girl's call doesn't—" "There's more," Sullivan interrupted. "Sergeant Jensen." Jensen stepped forward, his Midwestern features familiar to Hayward, though it took a moment for recognition to dawn. "Eric Jensen," Hayward said slowly. "Your family had the farm on County Line Road." "That's right," Jensen replied. "The one you swindled from my mother after my father died. Offered her 30% below market value when she had nowhere else to turn." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Is that so, Thomas?" "Business is business," Hayward defended. "Nothing illegal about negotiating." "Perhaps not," Sullivan agreed. "But attempted murder is very illegal, as is filing false police reports and obstruction of justice." Inside the house, Sean Hayward arrived with his mother having been summoned by Sheriff Potter. The teenager's face drained of color when he saw the assembled group on the porch. "Sean," Sheriff Potter said, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened last night. And before you answer, you should know we have Sophie's recorded call for help, physical evidence from the oak tree, and statements from Dylan and Melissa." Victoria Hayward placed a protective hand on her son's shoulder. "My son doesn't have to say anything without a lawyer." "That's his right," Sullivan acknowledged. "But this can go one of two ways. A full federal investigation into what happened here, including your husband's business practices, or a local resolution focused on accountability and restitution." Sean looked from his father's stone face to Sophie, who stood in the doorway, bruised but unbowed. "Dad," he said quietly, "I can't do this anymore." To everyone's surprise, it was Robert Miller who broke the tense silence. "Why don't we all sit down inside Helen's made coffee, and I think we need to talk like neighbors, not enemies." 6 months later, the changes in Millfield were subtle but significant. Sean Hayward had left for a military academy, not the prestigious West Point his father had envisioned, but a structured environment where discipline was tempered with compassion. His guilty plea to reduce charges had resulted in probation, community service, and mandatory counseling. Thomas Hayward had resigned from Agritech amid an internal investigation into his business practices. The revelation that he had systematically undervalued family farms while hiding his conflicts of interest had shattered his carefully constructed image. At Millfield High, Principal Morris had established a zero-tolerance policy for bullying, with Dylan Cooper heading a student committee on school climate. Melissa Foster had discovered a talent for journalism, documenting the changes in her community for the school paper. Sophie Miller stood beneath the oak tree, now bare in the December chill. The place that had once been a site of terror had reclaimed its status as her thinking spot, its enduring strength a reminder of her own resilience. "Penny for your thoughts," said a familiar voice behind her. Sophie turned to see Sullivan approaching across the frosted field. His civilian clothes couldn't disguise his military bearing, but the lines around his eyes had softened. "Just thinking about how much has changed," she replied, smiling. "How long are you staying this time?" "My leave runs through the new year," Sullivan said, coming to stand beside her. "After that, I've requested a training position at Wright Pat, close enough to visit regularly." Sophie nodded, understanding the significance of this choice. Delta operators didn't typically request training assignments unless they were considering their post-combat futures. "Mom's making your favorite apple pie for dinner," she said. "Dad finally got that tractor transmission fixed with the settlement money." The legal resolution had included financial restitution to the Miller farm, along with several other families who had been undervalued in Agritech transactions. The community fund established as part of the settlement was helping to preserve family farms throughout the county. Sheriff Potter called, Sullivan mentioned it as they walked back toward the farmhouse. He's recommending you for that summer internship with the county emergency services. Sophie smiled. I think I'd be good at that, staying calm in a crisis, helping people who need it. The best kind of guardian, Sullivan agreed, glancing back at the oak tree standing sentinel over the Miller farm, the kind who's there when called, but hopes never to be needed. As they reached the porch, Helen appeared in the doorway, waving them in from the cold. Inside, the warmth of the farmhouse wrapped around them like a promise kept not just by Sullivan, but by a community that had found its way back to what mattered. The storms, both literal and metaphorical, had passed. What remained was stronger for having weathered them. The Millfield Town Hall stood decorated for the annual Winter Festival, its classical columns wrapped in evergreen garlands and white lights that glowed softly against the early evening sky. Inside, the community had gathered for what had become in recent months more than just a seasonal celebration. It was a reaffirmation of values nearly lost under Thomas Hayward's influence. Sophie Miller stood near the refreshment table, watching the interactions with the keen eye she had developed over the past 6 months. Her internship with County Emergency Services had given her a new perspective on the town and its people. She could see the healing happening sometimes in the smallest of gestures, a handshake between former rivals. Laughter shared across once rigid social lines, genuine conversation, replacing political posturing. Sullivan appeared at her side, 2 cups of hot cider in hand. He offered one to Sophie before following her gaze across the room where Sean Hayward stood in his military academy uniform, speaking quietly with Dylan Cooper. Think that friendship will last? Sophie asked. Sullivan considered the question with his usual care. Hard to say, but the fact they're talking at all is something of a miracle. Sean's transformation had surprised everyone, except perhaps Sullivan. Away from his father's toxic influence and placed in an environment that valued integrity over dominance, Sean had begun to rebuild himself from the ground up. His letters to Sophie, part of his restitution program, but soon becoming genuine correspondence, revealed a young man slowly discovering who he might become when not measured against impossible standards. He asked if I'd write to him at the academy, Sophie said. I think I will. Sullivan nodded approvingly. Forgiveness is a choice, not an obligation. But it can be powerful when freely given. Across the room, Victoria Hayward entered noticeably sober and standing straighter than Sophie had ever seen her. The divorce from Thomas had been finalized last month, and with it seemed to have come a release from decades of quiet desperation. She made her way toward her son, exchanging polite greetings with townsfolk who had once been mere social accessories to her husband's ambitions. Sheriff Potter approached Sophie and Sullivan, his weathered face creased in a genuine smile. There's our hero, he said, extending his hand to Sophie. Emergency Services Director tells me you're the best intern they have ever had. Sophie blushed slightly. I'm just doing what I was taught, she replied, glancing at Sullivan. Well, whatever you're doing, keep it up. That quick thinking during the highway accident last week saved lives. The sheriff turned to Sullivan. And how are things at Right Pat Colonel getting used to teaching instead of doing? Turns out there's plenty of doing in teaching, Sullivan replied with a slight smile. Just a different kind of mission. Their conversation was interrupted by the town mayor stepping to the podium at the front of the hall. The crowd quieted as he prepared to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and neighbors, he began, his voice carrying across the room. Before we continue our celebration, I'd like to take a moment to recognize someone who reminded us all what it means to be a community. Sophie felt a sudden warmth in her cheeks as all eyes turned toward her. Sophie Miller, the mayor continued, would you please join me up here? With a gentle nudge from Sullivan, Sophie made her way to the podium, acutely aware of the attention focused on her. 6 months ago, a terrible incident nearly cost this young woman her life, the mayor said. But from that darkness came light. Sophie's courage didn't just save herself, it saved Millfield from becoming something none of us would recognize. He gestured to a small plaque on the podium. This award for civilian courage is just a small token of our appreciation. But perhaps more meaningful is what Sophie's actions have inspired. The mayor turned to the back of the room where Robert Miller stood with several other farmers. The Millfield Agricultural Trust, established with funds from the Agritech settlement and now supporting family farms throughout the county. The Youth Leadership Council giving our young people a real voice in community decisions, and the Emergency Response Network ensuring no one in Millfield will ever be left alone in a crisis again. As applause filled the room, Sophie found herself unable to speak. Instead, she looked out at the faces before her, her parents beaming with pride. Dylan and Melissa standing side by side, Sean offering a solemn nod of respect, and Sullivan watching with quiet satisfaction. When the applause died down, Sophie finally found her voice. "I didn't do anything special," she said. "I just refused to give up. And I had help from friends I knew and friends I didn't know I had yet." She glanced at Dylan and Melissa. "Sometimes the bravest thing isn't standing up to your enemies, but standing up to your friends when they're wrong." Her eyes found Sullivan in the crowd. "And sometimes the most important thing is keeping your promises even when they're made to a child, even when years have passed." She accepted the plaque with a shy smile. "Thank you for this honor. But the real strength of Millfield isn't in any one person, it's in all of us choosing to be better than we were yesterday." As Sophie returned to her place beside Sullivan, she felt a sense of completion. The ordeal that had begun at the oak tree had come full circle, transforming not just her life, but the life of an entire community. "You did good, kid," Sullivan said quietly, his voice carrying a rare note of emotion. "We did good," Sophie corrected him. "I just made the call. You showed up." Sullivan's smile held decades of hard-won wisdom. "That's how it works. Nobody makes it alone." Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Sophie and Sullivan found themselves back at the oak tree. The winter moon cast long shadows across the frosted field, turning the ancient oak into a silver sentinel against the night sky. "I never thanked you properly," Sophie said, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Not just for coming when I called, but for everything before that. For teaching me to be strong even when I was afraid." Sullivan's gaze remained on the distant horizon where the lights of Millfield twinkled against the darkness. "You were always strong, Sophie. I just helped you see it." She fingered the dog tag still hanging around her neck. "Will you want these back now that the emergency's over?" Sullivan shook his head. "They're part of you now. Besides," he added with a rare smile, "I suspect life will throw plenty more emergencies your way. Not all storms come with lightning and thunder." Sophie nodded, understanding the deeper truth in his words. "But not all storms destroy either. Some just clear the air so new things can grow." As they walked back toward the warmth of the farmhouse, Sophie looked up at the stars emerging in the clearing sky. The same stars she had seen through the branches of the oak tree as a child listening to Sullivan's stories. The same stars that had witnessed her darkest moment of fear and her triumph over it. "You know," Sullivan said thoughtfully, "there's a special operations selection coming up in about 6 years, right around the time you'd be finishing college." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. "You think I could qualify?" "I think you already have," Sullivan replied. "The rest is just training." The implication hung in the air between them, not just a possible future, but a recognition of the path they had traveled together. From a wounded soldier and a curious child to a battle-hardened warrior and a young woman coming into her own strength. The oak tree stood silhouetted against the night sky behind them, its branches reaching toward the stars scarred by storm, yet still standing. Like Sophie herself, like the promise that had brought Sullivan across continents and through darkness to keep his word. Some bonds forged in moments of grace and tested in times of crisis become unbreakable. Some promises once made reshape not just two lives, but entire worlds around them. As they reached the porch, the golden light from the farmhouse windows spilled out to greet them, a beacon of home and safety in the winter night. Inside waited family and friends, hot apple pie and laughter, the simple treasures that make life worth the struggles to preserve them. Sullivan paused at the threshold, his hand resting briefly on Sophie's shoulder, a gesture that contained within it all the pride, affection, and respect words could never fully express. "Ready?" he asked. Sophie nodded, stepping into the light. "Ready." Together they crossed the threshold, leaving the darkness and the cold behind them. The storm had passed, the oath had been kept, and the road ahead for both of them stretched toward horizons neither could have imagined alone. In the eastern field of Oakwood Farm, the ancient oak tree stood silent witness to this passage, its roots deep in the soil of generations past, its branches reaching toward futures yet unwritten. A testament to the enduring power of promises made and kept come what may.